Jake Holloway bought a Montana farm for $2 and found an 8-year-old boy living in the barn who wasn't supposed to exist. Keeping him would mean breaking the law, but sending him back into the system would break something far more important. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake Holloway never expected his life to change over 2 crumpled dollar bills and a handshake with a dying man. At 42, he had made peace with the wandering existence that defined him, drifting from ranch to ranch across Montana, hiring his skills out to whoever needed an extra hand during branding season or harvest time. He owned nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a battered truck that had seen better days before he was born. That was enough. Or so he had told himself for the better part of 2 decades, ever since the day he walked away from his father's ranch and never looked back. The June sun beat down mercilessly on the county courthouse steps where Jake stood, hat in hand, staring at the deed that had just been pressed into his palm. The paper felt impossibly light for something that represented 200 acres of Montana grassland, a falling down farmhouse, and a barn that looked like the next strong wind might finally claim it. $2. That was all old Thomas Brennan had asked for his life's work before the cancer took him last month. $2 and a promise that Jake would never sell the land to developers who were already circling like vultures, eager to carve the property into subdivisions with names like Prairie View Estates or Montana Heights. Jake had made that promise easily enough. He knew what it meant to love land the way Thomas had, even if he had spent most of his adult life running from that very attachment. There was something about the desperation in the old man's eyes during those final days in the hospital that had reached past Jake's carefully constructed defenses. Thomas had no family, no children to inherit his legacy, just a lifetime of hard work poured into soil that most people would consider worthless. The land was too far from town to be convenient, the soil too rocky for serious farming, and the water rights were tangled in legal disputes that dated back to territorial days. But Thomas had loved it anyway, and somehow he had known that Jake would understand that kind of stubborn, impractical devotion. The lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of perpetual disapproval, cleared his throat impatiently. "The property is yours, Mr. Holloway. I have to say, Mr. Brennan's decision to sell for such a nominal sum was highly irregular. My firm advised against it, but he was quite adamant. There are some tax implications you should be aware of, and the property does come with certain encumbrances that you'll need to address." Jake nodded without really listening. Lawyers always had concerns and complications. That was their job. His job was simpler. He had given his word to a dying man, and now he owned a farm he had never seen. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of permanence, and now here he was, tied to 200 acres because he had been unable to refuse an old man's final request. "What kind of encumbrances?" Jake asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. He had already decided to drive out to the property that afternoon to see what $2 had bought him. The lawyer shuffled through his papers with practiced efficiency. Some unpaid property taxes, though not substantial. A lien from the county for road maintenance that Mr. Brennan had been disputing. And there's the matter of the dwelling that was built without proper permits on the eastern section. The lawyer looked up over his glasses. Mr. Brennan mentioned it was temporary housing for seasonal workers, but the county has no record of any workers being employed on the property for the past 5 years. Jake felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. "Someone's living out there?" The lawyer's expression remained neutral, but Jake caught a flicker of something else behind the professional facade. Discomfort, maybe, or concern. According to county records, yes, though the exact situation is somewhat unclear. I would suggest you contact the sheriff's department before visiting the property. There may be squatters who will need to be legally evicted. The word squatters sat wrong with Jake. It implied criminals or drifters taking advantage of an old man's absence. But Thomas had been sharp as a tack right up until the cancer stole his strength. If someone was living on his property, he had known about it. Jake tucked the deed into his jacket pocket and settled his hat back on his head. "I'll handle it." "Mr. Holloway," the lawyer called as Jake turned to leave, "I really must insist that you involve the proper authorities." Mr. Brennan's final months were somewhat complicated. His judgment may have been impaired by medication or illness. You could be walking into a difficult situation. Jake paused on the courthouse steps, looking out over the small Montana town that Thomas had called home for 60 years. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. This was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and remembered old favors and older grudges. Whatever was happening on his newly acquired property, Jake suspected it was more complicated than simple trespassing. "I appreciate your concern," he said, keeping his voice polite but firm. "But I reckon if Thomas wanted the sheriff involved, he would have said so. I'll see to things myself." The drive to the Brennan place took 40 minutes along increasingly rough roads that wound through open grassland and stands of ponderosa pine. Jake's truck protested the washboard gravel with every rattle and squeak, but it held together the way it always had. As he crested a low rise, the farm came into view, spread across a natural basin where a creek meandered through cottonwood trees. The house was exactly as advertised, falling down in slow motion, its paint long since surrendered to the weather. The barn leaned at an alarming angle, defying gravity through what looked like sheer stubbornness. But it was beautiful. Jake felt it in his chest, that catch of recognition that came from seeing land that spoke to something deep and fundamental in his bones. The grass moved in waves under the wind, and the mountains framed the horizon like a promise. He understood why Thomas had held on so long, why he had poured his life into this isolated piece of earth that offered nothing but space and silence and the kind of freedom that had become rare in the modern world. Jake parked in what had once been a driveway and climbed out of the truck, stretching muscles that had stiffened during the drive. The place was quiet in the way that only truly remote locations could be, without even the distant hum of highway traffic to remind you that civilization existed somewhere beyond the horizon. He walked toward the house, his boots crunching on gravel and hard-packed dirt, alert for any sign of the mysterious occupant the lawyer had mentioned. That's when he saw it. A small structure behind the main house, something between a shed and a cabin, with smoke rising from a metal chimney pipe. Someone was definitely living here. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, where he usually carried a knife, but he forced himself to relax. Whatever this situation was, he doubted it required violence. Thomas had been many things, but he had not been a man who tolerated danger on his property. Jake approached the cabin slowly, giving whoever was inside plenty of time to notice his presence. "Hello," he called out. "My name is Jake Holloway. I'm the new owner of this property. I'm not here to cause trouble, but I need to know who's living in my barn." The door opened so quickly that Jake realized someone had been watching him since he arrived, but instead of the grizzled drifter or desperate vagrant he had half expected, a boy stood in the doorway. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, rail-thin and wary, with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. The boy's clothes were clean but patched, and he held himself with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. For a long moment, they stared at each other, man and boy, across the dusty yard. Then the boy spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Brennan said someone would come eventually. He said I should tell them the truth." The boy's small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "My name is Daniel. I'm 8 years old, and I don't have anywhere else to go." Jake felt the ground shift beneath his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the uneven earth of the farmyard. A child. Thomas Brennan had left him a farm with a child living on it, and somehow the old man had neglected to mention this rather significant detail during their conversations in the hospital. Or perhaps Thomas had mentioned it in his own way, with those cryptic comments about promises and responsibilities that Jake had half heard through the fog of morphine and failing breath. The boy, Daniel, stood perfectly still in the doorway of the small cabin, his posture rigid with the kind of tension that spoke of flight or fight instincts honed sharp by experience. Jake recognized it because he had worn that same wariness himself once, a lifetime ago, when he was not much older than this kid, and the world had seemed like a dangerous place full of adults who could not be trusted. "How long have you been living here?" Jake asked, keeping his voice gentle and his movements slow. He crouched down to make himself less imposing, though at 6'2" with shoulders broadened by years of ranch work, there was only so much he could do to appear non-threatening. 2 years and 4 months, Daniel replied with the precision of someone who had counted every day. Mr. Brennan found me hiding in his barn after I ran away from my foster placement in Billings. He said I could stay if I worked hard and stayed out of trouble. Jake's mind raced through the implications. A runaway foster kid, living undetected on an isolated property for more than 2 years. The lawyer's concerns suddenly made more sense, though Jake suspected the man had no idea of the real situation. If the authorities found out about Daniel, the boy would be swept back into the system immediately, and Jake would likely face charges for harboring a runaway, regardless of the fact that he had only learned of Daniel's existence 10 minutes ago. "Does anyone else know you're here?" Jake asked. Daniel shook his head. "Mr. Brennan taught me how to hide when people came around. The county assessor, the feed delivery guy, the propane man. I know all their schedules. I know how to be invisible." The matter-of-fact way the boy described his life of hiding made something twist in Jake's chest. This was not childhood. This was survival, and no 8-year-old should have to be that good at disappearing. "Why did you run away from your foster home?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer. There were only so many reasons a kid took that kind of risk. Daniel's expression closed down immediately, his eyes going flat and distant. "That's my business, mister. Brennan never asked, and he said I didn't have to tell anyone anything I didn't want to tell." "Fair enough," Jake said, respecting the boundary even as 100 questions crowded his mind. "But we've got a situation here now. Thomas is gone, and I own this property. That means we need to figure out what happens next." "Are you going to call the police?" Daniel asked, and there was no fear in his voice, only resignation. He had clearly been through this before, knew the routine, understood that adults had rules and systems that did not account for kids like him who fell through the cracks. "No," Jake said, surprising himself with the certainty of his answer. "Not right now. But I need to understand what I'm dealing with here. Thomas left me this farm and $2 to my name. I've got no job lined up, no income, and apparently a kid to figure out what to do with." "I can take care of myself," Daniel said quickly. "I don't need charity. Mr. Brennan taught me how to hunt and fish. I know how to garden. I can work. I'm not useless." The fierce pride in the boy's voice reminded Jake so strongly of himself at that age that he had to look away for a moment. He had said almost exactly those words to his father once, trying to prove his worth after his mother left, trying to show that he could carry a man's load despite being barely 10 years old. "I never said you were useless," Jake replied. "But the law says you're supposed to be in school and living with people who are responsible for you. They have systems for this kind of thing." "The systems don't work," Daniel shot back, his composure cracking slightly. "They put me with people who were supposed to take care of me, and they didn't. They put me with people who said they wanted to help, and they were lying. Mr. Brennan was the first person who ever just let me be myself without trying to fix me or change me or make me into something I'm not." Jake stood slowly, processing this information. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. He needed to make a decision, and whatever he chose would change both their lives irrevocably. "Show me around," he said finally. "Show me how you've been living, what Thomas taught you. Then we'll figure out the rest." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through his careful mask. "You're not leaving?" "Not today," Jake said. "Maybe not for a while. I've got a farm to assess and decisions to make. Might as well understand what I'm working with." The boy hesitated for another moment, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of trick. Then he stepped back from the doorway in a gesture of cautious welcome. "The cabin is small, but it's got everything I need. Mr. Brennan helped me insulate it for winter. There's a wood stove and a bed and shelves for my books." "You have books?" Jake asked, following Daniel into the dim interior of the cabin. The space was indeed small, barely large enough for a single bed, a small table, and the wood stove that served as both heat and cooking surface. But it was meticulously organized, clean in a way that suggested someone who took pride in their limited possessions. Shelves made from scrap lumber held a surprising collection of books, everything from adventure novels to field guides to wildlife and edible plants. "Mr. Brennan brought them from the library in town," Daniel explained. "He had a card and he'd check out books for himself, but really they were for me. He said education was the most important thing, even more important than food sometimes." Jake picked up a worn copy of Hatchet and smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "This was one of my favorites when I was your age." "Mine too," Daniel said, and for the first time, something like hope flickered across his young face. "The story about the kid who survives in the wilderness after a plane crash, I've read it 7 times. They stood together in that small cabin as the afternoon light shifted and changed, 2 people who had not expected to meet, whose lives had been thrown together by the final act of an old man who apparently understood more about second chances than Jake had given him credit for. "What did Thomas tell you about me?" Jake asked suddenly. "Did he mention that someone might come?" Daniel nodded. "A couple of months ago, when he got really sick. He said he was making arrangements. He said there was a man who understood what it meant to run from something, and that man might be able to understand why I needed to stay hidden. He said if anyone came looking for me after he was gone, I should tell them the truth and see if they were the kind of person who could hear it." Jake absorbed this, feeling the weight of Thomas Brennan's faith settling onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The old man had orchestrated this carefully, leaving breadcrumbs and hoping Jake would be smart enough and decent enough to follow them to this moment. "I hear you," Jake said quietly. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I hear you." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its call echoing across the empty grassland. This place, this isolated farm that Thomas had loved enough to protect with his final breath, held secrets that were only beginning to reveal themselves, and Jake Holloway, who had spent 2 decades running from responsibility and commitment, found himself standing at the threshold of a choice that would define the rest of his life. "Are you hungry?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence with the kind of practical question that suggested he had learned to focus on immediate needs rather than uncertain futures. "I've got venison stew from yesterday. Mr. Brennan taught me his recipe." "Yeah," Jake said, removing his hat and setting it on the small table. "I could eat." As Daniel busied himself with reheating the stew on the wood stove, Jake watched the boy move with practiced efficiency through the small space. This kid had been taking care of himself for over 2 years, surviving through wit and caution and the kindness of a dying man who had seen something in him worth protecting. The question was whether Jake had the courage to continue what Thomas had started, knowing full well that the path ahead was complicated and possibly illegal and would almost certainly break his heart. The venison stew was better than anything Jake had eaten in recent memory, rich with herbs that Daniel said he had grown himself in a small garden plot behind the cabin. As they ate in companionable silence, Jake studied the boy more carefully. Daniel's hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with tools regularly, and his movements had the efficient grace of a child who had learned to do things right the first time because there was no one to help him fix mistakes. He was small for his age, probably undernourished during his early years, but there was a wiry strength in his frame that spoke of hard physical labor and outdoor living. "Mr. Brennan taught you to cook?" Jake asked between bites. "He taught me everything," Daniel replied, a note of fierce loyalty in his voice. "How to split wood so it burns clean, how to read animal tracks, how to tell which plants are safe to eat and which ones will make you sick. He said a man who can't take care of himself isn't really free, just dependent on other people's mercy." Jake recognized the philosophy. It was the same one his own grandfather had lived by, back before the world got complicated and families fractured under the weight of expectations and disappointments. There was wisdom in that old-fashioned self-reliance, though Jake knew it could also be a kind of prison, isolating you from the very connections that made life worth living. "What about reading and writing?" Jake asked. "Math and science and all that school stuff?" Daniel's expression grew guarded again. "I can read fine. Better than fine. Mr. Brennan had me read to him every night. History books mostly, and sometimes poetry. He said a man who doesn't know history is doomed to repeat other people's mistakes." "That's not what I asked," Jake said gently. "I asked about school." The boy looked down at his bowl, pushing the last bits of venison around with his spoon. "I do workbooks. Mr. Brennan bought them from the homeschool supply store in town. Said if anyone asked, he was getting them for his niece. He made me do math every day and write essays about what I was reading. He checked my work and made me do it over if it wasn't good enough." Jake felt something loosen in his chest. Thomas had not just been hiding Daniel. He had been educating him, preparing him for a future beyond survival. That changed things, though Jake was not entirely sure how. "Where are these workbooks?" Jake asked. Daniel pointed to a wooden crate under the bed. "There's 2 years' worth. Mr. Brennan said I was working at a 6th grade level now, even though I'm only supposed to be in 3rd grade. He said I was smart enough to go to college someday if I wanted." The casual way Daniel mentioned college as if it were a real possibility rather than an impossible dream told Jake everything he needed to know about what Thomas Brennan had given this boy. Not just shelter and food, but hope. The most dangerous and precious gift you could give a kid who had every reason to believe the world had nothing good in store for him. After they finished eating, Daniel insisted on washing the dishes in a basin of water he heated on the stove. Jake watched him work with the methodical care of someone who had learned that taking care of your possessions was the difference between having something and having nothing. When the dishes were clean and put away, Daniel turned to face Jake with the same wary expression he had worn when they first met. "What happens now?" the boy asked. "Are you going to stay, or are you going to leave and pretend you never saw me?" Jake had been asking himself the same question for the past 2 hours. The smart thing would be to walk away, maybe make an anonymous call to child services from a payphone in the next county. Let the system sort it out while he moved on to the next ranch job, the next temporary situation that required nothing from him but his labor and his ability to disappear when things got complicated. That was what he had done for 20 years. And it had kept him safe from the kind of pain that came with caring too much about things you could lose. But something had shifted when he saw Daniel standing in that doorway, something fundamental that Jake could not quite name. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, the years after his mother left when he had felt like an unwanted burden in his father's house. Maybe it was the knowledge that Thomas Brennan had trusted him with this, had seen something in Jake that suggested he was capable of being more than just a drifter, with calloused hands and a talent for avoiding commitment. Or maybe it was simply that, for the first time in 2 decades, Jake was tired of running. "I'm staying," he said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. At least for now. "This is my property, and I need to assess what needs to be done to make it livable. That falling down house isn't going to fix itself, and winter's coming in a few months." Daniel's eyes widened. "You're really staying? Even knowing about me?" "Especially knowing about you," Jake said. "Thomas left me this place for a reason, and I'm starting to think you're part of that reason. But we need to establish some ground rules. I'm not your father, and I'm not trying to replace Mr. Brennan. I'm just a guy who owns a farm and is trying to figure out what to do with it." "What kind of ground rules?" Daniel asked, his posture tense. "First, you keep doing your schoolwork. Education's important, and Thomas was right to make you take it seriously. Second, you help me with the repairs and maintenance around this place. I can't pay you, but you'll learn skills that'll serve you well no matter what happens down the road. And third, if anyone comes around asking questions, you hide like Thomas taught you until I figure out how to handle the situation legally. What if you can't handle it legally?" Daniel's voice was steady, but Jake could see the fear behind his eyes. "What if they find out and take me away?" Jake met the boy's gaze directly, letting him see the truth in his expression. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But I'm not going to hand you over to anyone without a fight. Thomas trusted me with this place, and with you. I may not be worth a damn in a lot of ways, but I keep my promises to dying men." The tension in Daniel's shoulders eased slightly, though Jake could see the boy was not entirely convinced. That was fair. Jake had not earned his trust yet, and trust was not something you could demand or expect. It was something you built, day by day, through consistent action and keeping your word even when it was difficult. "There's something else you should know," Daniel said quietly. "Mr. Brennan said there might be trouble with some people in town. He said there were men who wanted to buy this land and turn it into something else, and they weren't the kind of men who took no for an answer nicely." Jake remembered the lawyer's mention of developers circling the property. Thomas's insistence on that promise not to sell suddenly made more sense. This was not just about preserving a legacy. It was about protecting something from people who saw land as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited for profit. "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked. Daniel shrugged. He didn't say exactly. Just that I should be careful and stay out of sight even more than usual. He said some people didn't like that he wouldn't sell, and they might try to cause problems after he was gone. Great, Jake thought. A runaway kid, a falling down farm, and apparently some kind of land dispute with people who were not above causing trouble. He had gone from owning nothing to owning problems he could not begin to solve in the span of a single afternoon. His old life of drifting from job to job was looking more appealing by the minute. But he had given his word, both to Thomas and now to Daniel. And despite 20 years of running from anything that resembled responsibility, Jake Holloway had never broken a promise once made. "We'll figure it out," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Right now, let's focus on the basics. I need to see the main house and the barn, figure out what's salvageable and what needs to be torn down and rebuilt. You up for giving me a tour?" Daniel nodded, grabbing a flashlight from a shelf. "The electricity in the main house hasn't worked in years. Mr. Brennan said it would cost too much to fix the wiring and he didn't need it anyway. But there's a generator in the barn that still runs if you need power for tools." As they walked across the darkening yard toward the main house, Jake felt the weight of his decisions settling onto his shoulders. He was 42 years old, owned a farm worth maybe $2, and had just committed himself to protecting a runaway kid from a system that would see Jake as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. It was possibly the most foolish thing he had ever done. It was also, he realized with a strange sense of clarity, possibly the first truly important thing he had done in 20 years. The main house was worse than Jake had imagined from the outside. Daniel's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rooms that had been slowly surrendering to time and weather for what looked like decades. The roof leaked in at least a dozen places, evidenced by water stains on the ceiling and buckets strategically placed to catch drips during storms. The floorboards were warped and rotted in several spots, and Jake could see daylight through gaps in the walls where the chinking had fallen away. It would take thousands of dollars and months of work to make this place truly livable, resources Jake simply did not have. Mr. Brennan mostly stayed in the back bedroom, Daniel explained, leading Jake through the debris-strewn living room. He said the rest of the house was too far gone to bother with. He used to talk about fixing it up someday, but I think he knew he'd never get around to it. Jake examined the back bedroom and found it in marginally better condition than the rest of the house. The roof appeared sound in this section, and Thomas had made efforts to seal the walls against drafts. There was a simple bed frame, a dresser with a mirror that had seen better days, and a kerosene lamp on the nightstand. It was Spartan but functional, the living space of a man who had long since stopped caring about comfort and focused solely on survival. "I can work with this," Jake said, more to himself than to Daniel. "The bedroom's solid enough for now. I'll sleep here and we can tackle the rest of the house once I've got some money coming in." "How are you going to get money?" Daniel asked, his practical nature showing through. Mr. Brennan lived off his Social Security, but that stopped when he died. There's no income from the land. He stopped running cattle years ago when he got too old to manage them. Jake had been wondering the same thing. His savings amounted to about $800, barely enough to cover basic supplies and feed for a few months. He would need to find work, but that meant leaving Daniel alone on the property, which seemed like a recipe for disaster given the boy's precarious legal situation. "I'll figure something out," Jake said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Maybe I can pick up some ranch work in the area, day labor kind of stuff that doesn't require me to be gone overnight." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something I should show you in the barn." They crossed the yard in the gathering darkness, and Jake noticed how comfortable Daniel seemed moving through the shadows. This was his territory, every rock and post and building familiar through 2 years of careful observation and navigation. The boy moved like a ghost, barely making a sound, and Jake understood how he had remained hidden from casual visitors for so long. The barn was in better shape than the house, though that was not saying much. The structure leaned at a dramatic angle, but the main support beams appeared sound, and the roof, while patched in multiple places, seemed to be keeping the weather out. Daniel led Jake to a corner where a tarp covered something large and rectangular. "Mr. Brennan kept this hidden," Daniel said, pulling back the tarp to reveal a vintage motorcycle, a beautiful machine that looked like it dated from the 1960s. He said it was worth money, but he could never bring himself to sell it. It belonged to his son. Jake felt his breath catch. Thomas had never mentioned having a son, though Jake realized they had not talked much about personal history during those hospital visits. The motorcycle was a classic, a Triumph Bonneville if Jake was not mistaken, the kind of bike that collectors paid serious money for if it was in working condition. "What happened to his son?" Jake asked quietly. "Vietnam," Daniel replied with the solemn tone of someone repeating a story they had heard multiple times. "He didn't come back. Mr. Brennan said this bike was the only thing he had left of him, besides memories. He said someday, when I was old enough, he'd teach me to ride it." Jake ran his hand over the chrome fuel tank, which despite years of storage still gleamed in the flashlight beam. This bike could potentially solve his immediate financial problems. Vintage Triumphs in good condition could fetch $10,000 or more from the right buyer, but selling it felt like a betrayal of Thomas's memory and of the son who had died 40 years ago in a war that still haunted the men who survived it. "We're not selling this," Jake said firmly. "Your friend Thomas kept it for a reason, and we're going to respect that." Daniel's expression shifted, something like relief and gratitude flickering across his young face. "Even if we need the money?" "Even if we need the money," Jake confirmed. "Some things are more important than money. This bike is a memorial, and memorials are sacred." They stood together in the dim barn, the motorcycle gleaming between them like a promise from the past. Jake thought about the son who had ridden this machine, young and full of life before war consumed him. He thought about Thomas Brennan, grieving for decades while slowly losing his battle with the land and time and eventually cancer. And he thought about Daniel, an orphan of the modern world, given temporary sanctuary by a dying man who understood what it meant to lose everything that mattered. "There's more," Daniel said, leading Jake to another corner of the barn. Here, under another tarp, Jake found tools. Not the cheap mass-produced kind you bought at big box stores, but quality implements that had been maintained with care. There were saws and hammers, wrenches and socket sets, a complete woodworking bench with hand planes and chisels that made Jake's fingers itch to hold them. This was a craftsman's collection, the kind of tools you accumulated over a lifetime and passed down to the next generation. Mr. Brennan was a carpenter before he bought this place, Daniel explained. He said these tools built half the houses in this county back in the 50s and 60s. He was going to teach me woodworking, but he got too sick before we could really start. Jake picked up a hand plane, feeling the perfect balance of it in his palm. The blade was sharp, recently honed, and the wood of the handle was smooth from decades of use. With these tools, he could repair the house. With these tools, he could maybe even start a small business doing carpentry work for people in the area. It would not make him rich, but it might be enough to survive while he figured out the larger questions of what to do about Daniel and the farm and the future that Thomas Brennan had thrust upon him. "Your friend Thomas was a smart man," Jake said. "He left us what we needed to survive, even if he couldn't leave us money." Daniel nodded solemnly. He said money was just paper, but skills and tools were real wealth. He said as long as you could work with your hands and think with your head, you'd never really be poor. Jake smiled, despite the overwhelming nature of his situation. Thomas Brennan and his own grandfather would have gotten along well. They shared the same philosophy, the same understanding that true security came not from bank accounts but from competence and self-reliance. "Tomorrow we start working," Jake said, replacing the hand plane carefully on the workbench. "I'll assess what the house needs and make a plan. You'll keep up with your schoolwork and help me where you can. We'll figure out the rest as we go." "What about the people who want to buy the land?" Daniel asked. "What if they come around?" "If they come around, we'll deal with it," Jake replied. "But right now, I'm more worried about getting through the next few weeks than I am about hypothetical trouble from land developers." They walked back to Daniel's cabin through the darkness, and Jake found himself noticing details he had missed earlier. The neat stack of firewood under a tarp, protected from rain. The garden plot, with its carefully tended rows of vegetables. The rain barrel positioned to catch runoff from the cabin roof. Every element spoke of careful planning and hard-won knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of an old man passed down to a young boy who had absorbed it all like dry earth soaking up rain. At the cabin door, Daniel hesitated. "Where are you going to sleep tonight? The house isn't really set up for anyone." "I've got a sleeping bag in my truck," Jake said. "I'll make do in the bedroom until I can get it properly cleaned up and aired out." "You could stay here," Daniel offered, his voice uncertain. "The bed's big enough for two if we don't mind being cramped. Mr. Brennan used to sleep here sometimes when he wasn't feeling well enough to walk back to the house." Jake considered the offer. The practical part of him knew it made sense. The cabin was warm and dry, and there was no point in struggling with the main house in the dark. But another part of him hesitated, aware of the delicate trust they were building and not wanting to move too fast or presume too much. "That's generous of you," Jake said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that tonight and work on getting the house habitable tomorrow." Daniel nodded and stepped back to let Jake enter. As they prepared for sleep, moving around each other in the small space with careful courtesy, Jake found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning he had been a drifter with no ties and no obligations. Tonight he was responsible for 200 acres, a falling down farm, and a boy who had no one else in the world. It should have terrified him. Instead, as he settled onto one side of the narrow bed while Daniel curled up on the other, Jake felt something he had not experienced in 20 years. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Jake woke before dawn to the sound of Daniel moving quietly around the cabin, stoking the fire in the wood stove and heating water for what turned out to be instant coffee and oatmeal. The boy worked with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to managing his mornings alone. Jake watched through half-closed eyes, not wanting to disturb the routine, and noticed how Daniel moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. "You're awake," Daniel said without turning around. His awareness of Jake's change in breathing suggested the hypervigilance of a child who had needed to stay alert to survive. "I made enough for both of us." They ate breakfast as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Jake laid out his plan for the day. First priority was making the main house safe and weather-tight enough for him to sleep there. Daniel would continue his schoolwork in the morning, then help with repairs in the afternoon. It was a simple plan, but Jake had learned long ago that the best plans usually were. After breakfast, while Daniel settled at his small table with math workbooks, Jake walked the perimeter of the property to get a better sense of what Thomas Brennan had left him. The land was beautiful in the morning light, rolling grassland that stretched toward the mountains with the creek cutting through like a silver thread. He could see why Thomas had loved this place enough to pour his life into it, even as age and illness slowly won their inevitable victory. The property line was marked by old fence posts, many of them leaning or fallen, with barbed wire that had rusted through in multiple places. Fixing the fence would be a major project, one that Jake added to his growing mental list of tasks. As he walked, he noticed signs of wildlife everywhere: deer tracks near the creek, the scratchings of wild turkeys in the dirt, and what looked like elk droppings near the tree line. This was good land for hunting, which explained how Daniel and Thomas had managed to supplement their diet with fresh meat. When Jake returned to the cabin, he found Daniel deep in concentration over a page of long division problems. The boy's tongue poked out slightly as he worked, a gesture of focus that reminded Jake of himself at that age. He had never been much good at school, preferring the practical knowledge that came from working with his hands, but he appreciated seeing someone take education seriously. "How's it going?" Jake asked, settling onto the one chair in the cabin, while Daniel occupied the stool at the table. "Almost done," Daniel replied without looking up. "Mr. Brennan always checked my work before I could do anything else. He said mathematics was the language of the universe, and if you couldn't speak it, you were missing half of what the world was trying to tell you." "Smart man," Jake agreed. "When you're finished, grab your jacket. I want you to help me assess the house situation." They spent the next 2 hours examining every inch of the main house, with Jake pointing out structural issues and explaining what needed to be done to fix them. Daniel absorbed the information with the same focused attention he had given his math problems, asking intelligent questions that showed he was truly listening rather than just going through the motions. The roof was the most pressing concern. Jake counted at least 15 places where shingles had blown away or rotted through, and the flashing around the chimney had deteriorated to the point of uselessness. Without serious repairs, the next heavy rain would cause catastrophic damage to the interior. The problem was that roofing materials cost money Jake did not have, and the work was dangerous enough that he hesitated to involve Daniel beyond holding ladders and passing up tools. "We need about $2,000 worth of materials just for the roof," Jake said, more to himself than to Daniel. That's not counting the floor repairs, the wall sealing, or any of the other problems. My $800 won't even cover half the roofing supplies." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something else I should show you." Jake was beginning to recognize that phrase. Every time Daniel said there was something else to show him, it usually meant Thomas Brennan had left another piece of the puzzle that explained how a dying man and a runaway boy had survived on an isolated farm for 2 years. They walked to a small shed behind the barn that Jake had not noticed the previous evening. Daniel produced a key from a chain around his neck and unlocked the padlock securing the door. Inside, stacked neatly on shelves, were cases of ammunition, canned goods, and what looked like at least 50 pounds of various dried goods. But that was not what made Jake's breath catch. In the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, was a rifle and a shotgun, both of quality make, along with several boxes of ammunition. "Mr. Brennan said this was the emergency supply," Daniel explained. "He said if things got really bad, we'd have what we needed to survive for a long time. He said a man who prepares for trouble usually doesn't have to face it, but a man who doesn't prepare always does." Jake examined the firearms carefully. Both were well maintained and legally valuable. The rifle was a Winchester Model 70, a classic hunting weapon that collectors sought after. The shotgun was a Remington 870, workhorse reliable and worth several $100s even used. Together with the ammunition and supplies, this shed represented a significant investment in security and survival. "Did Thomas have papers for these guns?" Jake asked. "Registration? Bills of sale?" Daniel nodded and produced a metal box from beneath one of the shelves. "Everything's in here. He kept all the important documents together. Said if something happened to him, whoever came next would need to know what was legal and what wasn't." Jake opened the box and found it meticulously organized. Registration papers for both firearms, receipts for major purchases, and a handwritten inventory of everything in the shed dated and signed by Thomas Brennan. There was also a letter, sealed in an envelope with Jake's name written on the front in Thomas's careful script. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter was brief, but profound in its implications. "Jake, if you're reading this, you kept your promise and came to see about the boy. I knew you would. You're a good man even if you don't believe it yourself. Daniel needs someone who understands what it means to run from pain and who's finally ready to stop running. The guns are legally yours now, along with everything else. Sell them if you need to, but I'd rather you kept them for protection. There are people who wanted this land and who didn't take kindly to my refusal to sell. They might cause trouble after I'm gone. The boy knows how to hide, but I'm hoping you'll teach him how to stand and fight when hiding isn't enough. You've got everything you need to make a go of this place. The tools to work, the guns to protect it, and most important, you've got a reason to care. That boy saved me as much as I saved him. Maybe he can do the same for you. Thomas Brennan." Jake read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the metal box. He looked at Daniel, who was watching him with those two old eyes, waiting for judgment or rejection or whatever came next. "Your friend Thomas had a lot of faith in me," Jake said quietly. "I'm not sure it's deserved." "He had faith in me too," Daniel replied. "And I was just a scared kid hiding in his barn. Maybe faith isn't about deserving it. Maybe it's about what you do once someone gives it to you." The wisdom in those words, coming from an 8-year-old who had seen more hardship than most adults, hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought about the past 20 years, the way he had drifted from place to place, never putting down roots, never risking the kind of connection that could hurt him the way his mother's abandonment and his father's coldness had hurt him. Thomas Brennan had seen through all of that to something Jake had almost forgotten existed in himself: the capacity to care, the ability to commit, the courage to try. "All right then," Jake said, making a decision that felt both reckless and absolutely right. We're going to make this work. We'll sell the guns if we have to for materials money, but first I'm going to see if I can pick up some carpentry work in town. With Thomas's tools and my experience, maybe I can build up enough of a reputation to bring in steady income. What about me? Daniel asked. Do I have to stay hidden forever? Jake considered the question carefully. Not forever, but for now, while I figure out the legal situation, it's safer if people don't know you're here. Once I've established myself and understand who the players are in this town, we'll figure out how to bring you out of the shadows properly. What if we can't? What if there's no way to make it legal? Then we'll deal with that when it comes, Jake said. But I'm not giving up on you, kid. Thomas didn't, and neither will I. Daniel's eyes glistened with tears he was too proud to let fall, and Jake felt something crack open in his chest. Some wall he had built brick by careful brick over 2 decades of protecting himself from caring too much. This boy needed him, and Jake discovered that being needed was not the burden he had always believed it to be. It was a gift. Jake drove into town 3 days later with a truck bed full of Thomas's woodworking tools and a handwritten sign advertising carpentry services. Daniel had helped him make the sign, carefully lettering the words in neat block print that would be visible from a distance. The boy had wanted to come along, but they both understood the risk was too great. Instead, Daniel would spend the day working on his schoolwork and tending the garden, with strict instructions to hide in the root cellar beneath the barn if anyone came around. The town of Ridgeway was small enough that Jake could see from one end to the other from his parking spot on Main Street. There was a feed store, a diner, a hardware store, and a handful of other businesses that served the ranching community scattered across the surrounding valleys. Jake had passed through places like this 100 times in his wandering years, never staying long enough to learn the rhythms and relationships that defined small-town life. He set up his sign against the truck and waited, feeling conspicuous and uncertain. This was not how he usually found work. Normally he would hear about a job through word of mouth at a bar or from another ranch hand, show up and prove himself through labor rather than advertising. But circumstances had changed, and Jake was learning that caring about something meant taking risks he would have avoided in his previous life. The first person to approach was an older woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything about Jake in a single glance. She wore practical ranch clothes and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and having them respected. "You're the one who bought Thomas Brennan's place," she said. It was a statement, not a question, and Jake realized that in a town this size, news traveled faster than he had anticipated. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect his grandfather had drilled into him. "Jake Holloway." "Margaret Chen," she said, offering a hand calloused from years of work. "I own the Triple C Ranch about 10 miles north of Thomas's place. Heard you got the farm for $2 and a song." "Just $2, Jake corrected. "No song involved." Margaret's lips quirked in what might have been amusement. Thomas was a stubborn old coot, but he was a good neighbor. Helped me out more than once when I needed an extra hand or someone to watch the place while I was dealing with business in Billings. I was sorry to hear about the cancer. Jake nodded, unsure what to say. He had known Thomas for only a few weeks before the old man died, hardly enough time to form the kind of connection that warranted grief. But he understood the loss Margaret was describing, the disappearance of someone who had been woven into the fabric of community life for decades. "I've got a fence that needs mending," Margaret said abruptly. "Quarter-mile of posts that need replacing and wire that needs restringing. My regular hand broke his arm last week and I can't wait for it to heal. Do you any good with fence work?" "I've mended my share of fences over the years," Jake said. "I can do it right and do it to last." "Pay is $15 an hour plus lunch," Margaret said. "Start tomorrow if you're available." Jake did some quick mental math. At 15 an hour, a week of fence work would give him enough money to buy roofing materials and still have some left over for food and necessities. It was more than he had hoped for on his first day. "I'm available," he said. "What time?" "Sunrise," Margaret replied, "and bring your own tools. I've got wire and posts, but I expect a man to provide his own implements." After Margaret left, Jake felt a small surge of hope. One job was not a permanent solution, but it was a start. He was about to pack up his sign when a man in an expensive truck pulled up beside him. The vehicle was pristine, clearly designed more for showing off than for actual ranch work, and the man who climbed out wore clothes that screamed money and city origins, despite the cowboy hat he had obviously purchased to fit in with the locals. "Jake Holloway," the man said, offering a hand with a smile that was too practiced to be genuine. "I'm Richard Chambers. I represent Skyline Development Corporation. We've been trying to acquire the Brennan property for several years, and I understand you're the new owner." Jake shook the offered hand briefly. "That's right." Chambers launched into what was clearly a rehearsed pitch about the value of the land and the opportunities that development would bring to the area. He talked about jobs and economic growth and progress, all while carefully avoiding any mention of what would happen to the land itself. Jake had heard similar speeches before, usually from people who saw natural places as nothing more than blank slates waiting to be covered with concrete and profit. "The corporation is prepared to offer you $50,000 for the property," Chambers concluded. "That's well above market value for land in this condition. It's a generous offer, and I'd encourage you to consider it seriously." Jake thought about Thomas Brennan's letter, about the warning that people had wanted this land and had not taken kindly to refusal. He thought about Daniel, hidden away in the cabin, and about the promise he had made to a dying man. And he thought about the way the land had looked that morning, with the sun rising over the mountains and the creek running silver through the grass. "I appreciate the offer," Jake said carefully, "but the land's not for sale." Chambers' smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Holloway, I understand you have sentimental attachment to the property given your recent acquisition, but $50,000 is a life-changing amount of money for someone in your position. You could buy another property, something more manageable, and still have money left over to invest." "My answer's still no," Jake said. "The land's not for sale now and won't be for sale in the future." The smile disappeared entirely from Chambers' face. Mr. Brennan was equally stubborn, and it didn't serve him well. "I'd hate to see you make the same mistakes he did." The threat was barely veiled, and Jake felt his temper rise. He forced himself to remain calm, remembering Thomas's warning about these people. "Is that some kind of threat, Mr. Chambers?" "Not at all," Chambers replied smoothly. "Simply an observation that sometimes stubbornness leads to unfortunate consequences. The development is going forward regardless of whether we acquire your parcel. It would be easier for everyone if you cooperated." "Easier for you, maybe," Jake said. "Not necessarily easier for me." Chambers studied Jake for a long moment, his expression calculating. "You should know that we have ways of making things difficult for property owners who refuse to cooperate. Legal challenges, zoning issues, access disputes. It can become very expensive and very complicated very quickly." Jake met the man's gaze without flinching. "I've dealt with difficult before. I reckon I can handle it again." After Chambers drove away, Jake sat in his truck for a long time thinking about the encounter. Thomas's warnings had been accurate. There were people who wanted the land and who clearly had resources and determination to pursue their goals. The question was how far they were willing to go and whether Jake had just made himself and Daniel targets by refusing the offer. He spent the rest of the day visiting other businesses on Main Street, introducing himself and letting it be known that he was available for carpentry and general repair work. The response was cautiously positive. People remembered Thomas Brennan and seemed willing to give his successor a chance, though Jake sensed reservation in some of their reactions. Small towns were tight-knit communities, and strangers were viewed with natural suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. By late afternoon, Jake had lined up 3 smaller jobs in addition to Margaret Chen's fence work. It was not enough to guarantee long-term survival, but it was more than he had expected on his first day. As he drove back to the farm, he found himself thinking about how strange life had become in less than a week. He had gone from being a drifter with no responsibilities to being a property owner, a surrogate guardian, and apparently an enemy of corporate development interests. When he arrived at the farm, Daniel was waiting on the porch of the cabin, his posture tense until he recognized Jake's truck. The boy's relief was palpable as Jake climbed out and walked over. "How did it go?" Daniel asked. "Better than expected," Jake replied. "I've got work lined up starting tomorrow. Fence mending for a woman named Margaret Chen." "I know her," Daniel said. "She came to visit Mr. Brennan sometimes. She brought him soup when he was sick." Jake smiled at the image of the tough ranch woman showing such kindness. "That sounds like her. She seems like good people. Did anyone ask about me?" Daniel's question was casual, but Jake could hear the underlying anxiety. "No," Jake said, "but I did get visited by a man named Richard Chambers. He wants to buy the property." Daniel's expression darkened. "Mr. Brennan said to watch out for him. He said Mr. Chambers worked for people who didn't care about anything except money and would do whatever it took to get what they wanted." Jake nodded grimly. "I got that impression. I turned down his offer, which means we might have trouble ahead." Daniel absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned that trouble was simply part of life. "What do? We keep our heads down, do our work, and protect what's ours," Jake said. "And we watch our backs." The work on Margaret Chen's fence began before sunrise the next morning. Jake arrived at the CCC ranch to find Margaret already up and moving, checking on horses in the barn with the easy efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for decades. She showed him the fence line that needed attention, a quarter-mile of weathered posts and sagging wire that told the story of harsh winters and deferred maintenance. "You'll need to dig out the old posts and set new ones in concrete," Margaret said, gesturing along the property line. "The wire's salvageable in some spots, but you'll have to replace about half of it. I've got everything you need in the equipment shed." Jake surveyed the job with a practiced eye. It was hard work, the kind that would leave him sore and exhausted by day's end, but it was honest labor with a clear beginning and end. He found comfort in that simplicity after the complicated emotional terrain of the past week. As he worked through the morning, digging post holes and mixing concrete, Jake's mind wandered to Daniel back at the farm. The boy had been quiet at breakfast, working through his math problems with unusual intensity. Jake suspected Daniel was worried about being left alone, though he was too proud to admit it. They had established a system where Daniel would hang a white cloth on the cabin door if everything was fine, and a red one if there was trouble. Simple but effective, and it gave Jake some peace of mind as he labored under the Montana sun. Margaret brought him lunch around noon, sandwiches thick with roast beef and homemade bread that made Jake's store-bought meals seem pathetic by comparison. They sat in the shade of her barn, eating in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Margaret spoke. "Thomas talked about you before he died," she said. "Not by name, but he mentioned a man he'd met who reminded him of his son. Said you had the same restlessness, the same hurt behind your eyes." Jake was not sure how to respond to that. He took another bite of sandwich to buy time. "He was a good judge of character," Margaret continued. "If he trusted you with that land and whatever else he left you, there was a reason for it." The emphasis on whatever else made Jake look up sharply. Margaret's expression was neutral, but her eyes held knowledge that suggested she knew more than she was saying. "Ma'am, if you've got something to say, I'd appreciate you saying it directly," Jake said. Margaret smiled slightly. I like a man who speaks plain. All right then. Thomas called me about 3 months before he died. Asked me to keep an eye out for a boy if anything ever happened to him. Said there was a child on his property who needed protecting, and that if the wrong people found out, the boy would be lost in a system that had already failed him once. Jake felt his heart hammer against his ribs. So you know about Daniel? I know Thomas was hiding someone, Margaret corrected. I don't know details, and I'm not asking for them. What I am saying is that if you need help keeping that boy safe, you've got an ally. Thomas was good to me over the years. I owe him at least that much. The relief Jake felt was almost overwhelming. He had been carrying the weight of Daniel's situation alone, trying to figure out how to protect the boy while establishing himself in a community that might turn on him if they knew the truth. Having Margaret as an ally changed the equation significantly. Why are you telling me this now? Jake asked. Because Richard Chambers came to see me yesterday afternoon, Margaret said, her expression hardening. Wanted to know what I knew about you and whether I thought you'd be reasonable about selling the Brennan place. I told him you seemed like a man who kept his word, which meant if you said the land wasn't for sale, it wasn't for sale. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect, Margaret replied. He implied that I might regret not encouraging you to cooperate, said there were ways of making things difficult for people who stood in the way of progress. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. Are they threatening you because you won't pressure me to sell? They're trying to isolate you, Margaret said. Make it so nobody in town wants to associate with you or give you work. It's an old tactic. If they can't buy you out, they'll try to starve you out. That's not going to work, Jake said firmly. I've been poor before, I can be poor again. It's not just about money, Margaret warned. These development people have connections. They can make trouble with permits and inspections, can tie you up in legal battles that drain whatever resources you have. Thomas fought them for 5 years, and it wore him down. The cancer might have killed him, but the stress of fighting Skyline development certainly didn't help. Jake thought about Daniel, about the promise he had made to Thomas, about the land that had somehow claimed a piece of his heart in less than a week. He thought about the life he could build here if given the chance, something stable and meaningful after 20 years of drifting. I appreciate the warning, Jake said, and I appreciate you being willing to stand with me on this, but I'm not selling no matter what pressure they apply. Good, Margaret said with satisfaction. This valley doesn't need another subdivision full of people who don't understand the land. It needs folks like you and Thomas who are willing to work for it and protect it. They finished lunch and Jake returned to the fence line, working through the afternoon with renewed determination. Each post he set felt like a small act of defiance against the forces trying to push him out. By the time the sun started its descent toward the mountains, he had completed nearly half the fence line, his muscles aching but his spirits higher than they had been in years. When Jake returned to the farm as dusk settled over the valley, he was relieved to see the white cloth hanging from Daniel's cabin door. Everything was fine. He found the boy outside, tending to the small vegetable garden, with the careful attention Thomas had obviously taught him. Daniel looked up as Jake approached, his face brightening with relief. How was your day? Jake asked, settling onto the cabin steps. Quiet, Daniel replied. I finished all my math and started reading a new book about Lewis and Clark. Did you know they came through Montana on their way to the Pacific? I did not know that, Jake said, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. What else did you learn? Daniel launched into an animated summary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, his earlier worry forgotten in the joy of sharing knowledge. Jake listened, watching the last light fade from the sky and feeling something settle in his chest. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person to come back to. Someone who cared whether you returned safely. Someone whose day was made better by your presence. After dinner, as they sat by the wood stove working on their respective tasks, Daniel spoke up hesitantly. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Sure, kid. Are you going to stay?" Daniel's voice was carefully neutral, but Jake could hear the fear beneath it. "I mean really stay. Not just until you get bored or find something better." Jake set down the piece of harness he had been mending and looked directly at Daniel. The boy deserved honesty, not false promises. "I'm going to stay," Jake said firmly. "I won't lie to you and say it'll be easy or that there won't be challenges. Those development people are going to make trouble, and we've got the whole situation with keeping you safe to figure out. But I'm not running anymore. This is home now, and you're part of that." Daniel's eyes glistened in the lamplight, and he nodded without speaking. Sometimes the most important things did not need words. They sat together in the warm cabin, the wood stove crackling and the night settling around their small sanctuary. Two people who had found each other through circumstance and were choosing to become family through commitment. Outside, the Montana darkness stretched vast and deep, full of stars and possibilities. Jake thought about Margaret's warning, about the battles that lay ahead, about the precarious nature of the life they were trying to build. But he also thought about the fence posts he had set that day, solid and true in the earth. Some things were worth fighting for, some promises were worth keeping, and some homes were worth defending, no matter what the cost. 3 weeks into Jake's new life, trouble arrived in the form of a county inspector with a clipboard and an attitude that suggested he already knew what he was going to find. Jake was on the roof of the main house replacing shingles with materials he had purchased from his earnings at Margaret's ranch and several smaller carpentry jobs around town when a white county vehicle pulled into the yard. Daniel was supposed to be hidden in the root cellar beneath the barn, their agreed-upon protocol whenever strangers appeared on the property. Jake climbed down from the roof and met the inspector in the driveway, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Jake Holloway," he introduced himself, offering a hand that the inspector shook limply. "Gerald Morton, county building inspector," the man replied, consulting his clipboard. "I'm here to conduct an inspection of the structures on this property. We've received complaints about unpermitted construction and potential safety violations." Jake felt his stomach tighten. This was the harassment Margaret had warned him about, the bureaucratic pressure that Skyline Development would use to make his life difficult. "From who?" "That's confidential information," Morton replied. "But I'm authorized to inspect all structures on the property, including outbuildings. I'll need access to everything." Jake thought fast. The cabin where Daniel lived was clearly unpermitted construction, exactly the kind of thing that would give the county grounds to condemn the structure and possibly force Jake off the property entirely. He needed to cooperate enough to avoid legal trouble while protecting Daniel's hiding place. "The main house and barn are open for inspection," Jake said carefully. "The small cabin behind the barn is just storage, nothing habitable. I'll need to verify that myself," Morton said, already walking toward the cabin. Jake followed, his mind racing. Daniel should be in the root cellar by now. But what if he had not heard the vehicle? What if he was still inside the cabin? Jake kept his expression neutral as Morton approached the cabin door and tried the handle. It was locked. "I'll need the key," Morton said. Jake made a show of checking his pockets. "Must have left it in the house. Let me go grab it. I'll wait," Morton replied, his tone making it clear he suspected Jake was stalling. Jake walked back toward the main house, taking his time and trying to think of a way out of this situation. If Morton got inside the cabin and found evidence that someone was living there, it would raise questions Jake could not afford to answer. He was about to unlock the main house when he heard Margaret Chen's voice calling from the driveway. "Gerald Morton, you old buzzard, what brings you out here bothering my neighbors?" Jake turned to see Margaret climbing out of her truck, her expression friendly but her eyes sharp. She walked over to the inspector with the confidence of someone who had known him for years and was not intimidated by his official capacity. "Margaret," Morton said, his demeanor softening slightly. "Just doing my job. Got a complaint about this property. From Richard Chambers or someone he hired, I'd bet," Margaret said bluntly. "Come on, Gerald, we both know what's happening here. Skyline Development wants this land and they're using the county to harass the owner." "That's a serious accusation," Morton said, but his expression suggested Margaret had hit close to the truth. "It's the truth and you know it," Margaret replied. "Thomas Brennan lived on this property for 60 years without the county caring about permits or inspections. Now Jake's been here 3 weeks and suddenly you're crawling all over the place? That's not coincidence." Morton shifted uncomfortably. "I have to follow up on complaints regardless of the source." "Then do a proper inspection," Margaret said. "Check the main house and barn all you want, but that storage shed is on my property line. I lease it from Jake for equipment storage. You need a different warrant to inspect structures on leased property." Jake tried not to show his surprise at Margaret's lie. The cabin was clearly on his property, not anywhere near the boundary line. But Morton seemed uncertain, consulting his clipboard as if it might contain information about property boundaries. "I wasn't aware of any lease agreement," Morton said slowly. "Filed with the county clerk just last week," Margaret said smoothly. "You can verify it Monday when the office opens. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you'd respect private property rights." Morton looked between Margaret and Jake, clearly trying to decide whether to push the issue. Finally, he seemed to conclude that the potential complications were not worth whatever pressure Skyline Development had applied to send him here. "Fine," Morton said. "I'll inspect the main structures and verify the lease situation next week. But if I find that cabin is being used for habitation without proper permits, there will be consequences." Jake showed Morton through the main house and barn, pointing out the repairs he had already made and explaining his plans for bringing everything up to code. The inspector made notes and took photographs, but his heart did not seem to be in it. When Morton finally left an hour later, Jake and Margaret stood in the yard watching his vehicle disappear down the road. "Thank you," Jake said quietly. "That lease story probably bought us some time, but it won't hold up to serious scrutiny." "I know," Margaret replied, "which means we need to figure out a more permanent solution." "That boy can't hide forever, Jake." "I'm working on it," Jake said. Though he had no idea what that solution might look like, the legal complexities of Daniel's situation seemed insurmountable without risking the boy being swept back into the foster system he had fled. After Margaret left, Jake knocked on the barn door in the pattern he and Daniel had established. 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 more. The root cellar door opened and Daniel emerged, dust in his hair and fear in his eyes. "Is it safe?" the boy asked. "For now," Jake replied, "but we had a close call. The county inspector wanted to check your cabin." Daniel's face went pale. "What did you tell him?" Jake explained what had happened, including Margaret's quick thinking about the lease agreement. Daniel listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "How long before they come back?" Daniel asked. "Maybe a week. Maybe less if they realize Margaret was lying about the lease." Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said something that took Jake completely by surprise. "Maybe I should turn myself in. If I'm the problem, maybe removing me solves it." Anger flared in Jake's chest, hot and immediate. "Don't you ever say that again. You're not a problem to be solved. You're a kid who deserves safety and stability and someone who gives a damn about you." "But if I wasn't here, they couldn't use me to pressure you off the land," Daniel said logically. "You could fight them without worrying about protecting me." Jake crouched down so he was eye level with Daniel. "Listen to me. I didn't take on this farm just for the property. I took it on because Thomas trusted me to protect what he loved. And what he loved included you. Walking away from you would be breaking my promise to him and to myself." "Even if it costs you everything?" Daniel asked. "Especially then," Jake said firmly. Because what's the point of keeping the land if I become the kind of man who abandons kids when things get difficult? I've spent 20 years running from responsibility. I'm done with that. We face this together or not at all. Daniel's reserve finally cracked. He threw his arms around Jake's neck, holding on with desperate strength. Jake wrapped his arms around the boy, feeling the thin frame shaking with emotion. They stood like that for a long moment, and Jake realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this child had stopped being Thomas Brennan's responsibility and had become his own. That night, after Daniel had gone to sleep, Jake sat on the porch of the main house and stared up at the stars scattered across the Montana sky. The challenges ahead seemed overwhelming. Skyline Development was not going to give up. The county would continue to apply pressure through inspections and regulations. And eventually someone was going to discover that Daniel was living on the property illegally, which would bring consequences Jake could not fully anticipate. But he had made a choice, and he was going to see it through. Thomas Brennan had seen something in Jake worth trusting. Margaret Chen had stood beside him when she could have stayed out of it, and Daniel had shown courage and resilience that humbled Jake every day. Together they formed something fragile, but real, a family built not on blood, but on choice and commitment. In the barn, the vintage Triumph motorcycle gleamed in the moonlight, filtering through gaps in the walls. Jake thought about Thomas's son, young and full of promise before war claimed him. He thought about all the ways life could break you if you let it, but he also thought about the ways people could heal each other if they were brave enough to try. The crisis came on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after Jake had taken ownership of the farm. He was in town picking up supplies when he spotted Richard Chambers talking to Sheriff Tom Bradley outside the diner. The conversation looked casual enough, but Jake noticed Chambers gesturing in the direction of the Brennan property, and something about the sheriff's expression made Jake's instincts flare with warning. Jake loaded his supplies quickly and drove back to the farm faster than was probably safe on the gravel roads. When he arrived, he found Daniel sitting on the cabin steps with that too-still posture that meant something had frightened him. "What happened?" Jake asked, climbing out of the truck. "Someone was watching the property," Daniel said quietly. "I saw him from the barn loft. He had binoculars and was taking pictures from the ridge above the creek. When he saw me looking, he left in a hurry." Jake felt cold dread settle in his stomach. If Skyline Development had photographic evidence of Daniel living on the property, they could use it to force a child welfare investigation. The authorities would take Daniel into custody while they sorted out the legal situation, and Jake would have no say in what happened to the boy. "Did he get a clear picture of you?" Jake asked. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I ducked back inside pretty quick, but he might have gotten something." Jake made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. "We need to go talk to the sheriff before Chambers does, get the truth out there on our terms rather than theirs." Daniel's eyes widened with fear. "But if you tell the sheriff about me, they'll take me away." "Maybe," Jake said, "or maybe there's a way to do this that keeps you safe. But we can't keep hiding forever. It's time to trust that there are good people in this system who'll do the right thing." The drive to the sheriff's office was silent except for the rumble of the truck engine. Daniel sat pressed against the passenger door, his face pale but resolute. Jake kept glancing over at him, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. But the alternative was waiting for the hammer to fall on their own terms, and Jake had learned long ago that waiting for disaster rarely improved the outcome. Sheriff Bradley was in his office when they arrived, a man in his 50s with weathered features and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. He looked up as Jake and Daniel entered, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to careful attention when he saw the boy. "Sheriff, I need to report a situation," Jake said before he could lose his nerve. "This is Daniel. He's been living on my property for the past 2 years, first with Thomas Brennan and now with me. He's a runaway from the foster system in Billings. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying them both. Is that so? And you're just now bringing this to my attention? I only found out about him when I took ownership of the property, Jake explained. Thomas Brennan was protecting him, and I've been trying to figure out the right thing to do. The right thing would have been to contact authorities immediately, Sheriff Bradley said, but his tone was more thoughtful than accusatory. Though I suppose you had your reasons for not doing that. Daniel stepped forward, his voice quiet but steady. The last foster home I was in, the father hit me when I didn't do chores fast enough. When I told my caseworker, she said I was making trouble and that I should be grateful anyone was willing to take me. So I ran. Mr. Brennan found me and gave me a safe place. He taught me things and treated me like I mattered. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. That's a serious accusation about the foster home. I have bruises in my school photos from that time, Daniel said. Mr. Brennan kept copies. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone would need proof that I wasn't lying about why I ran. Sheriff Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Jake listened as the sheriff talked to someone at the state child welfare office, explaining the situation in careful detail. When he hung up, his expression was grim but not unsympathetic. They're sending a caseworker from Billings. She'll be here Monday morning to assess the situation. In the meantime, Daniel will need to be placed in temporary protective custody. No, Daniel said, his voice rising with panic. Please don't make me go back. It's just temporary, the sheriff said gently, until they can investigate your allegations about the previous foster home and evaluate Mr. Holloway as a potential guardian. Jake felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Guardian? Is that possible? It's complicated, Sheriff Bradley said. You're not a blood relative and you've only known the boy for a few weeks. But given the circumstances and the allegations about the previous placement, they might consider alternative arrangements. No guarantees, though. What can I do? Jake asked desperately. Get yourself a lawyer, the sheriff advised, and be prepared to prove you can provide a stable home. The state's going to look at your employment history, your living situation, your background. They'll want to know why a 42-year-old bachelor suddenly wants to take responsibility for a child who's not his. Because he needs me, Jake said simply. And because I made a promise to a dying man. And because in 6 weeks this kid has become more important to me than anything else in my life. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then you fight for him. But right now I need to take him to a temporary placement. It's the law. Jake looked at Daniel, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. The boy had been through so much already, and now Jake was sending him back into the very system he had fled. It felt like betrayal, even though Jake knew it was the only legal option. I'll come get you, Jake promised, crouching down to Daniel's level. However long it takes, whatever I have to do, I'm coming to bring you home. What if they won't let you? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Then I'll keep fighting until they do, Jake said fiercely. You're not alone anymore. You have someone who's going to stand up for you no matter what. As Sheriff Bradley led Daniel out to the patrol car, Jake stood in the parking lot feeling like he had just sent a piece of his own heart away. The boy looked back once, his face pressed against the window, and Jake raised his hand in farewell, trying to look more confident than he felt. That evening, Jake sat in the empty cabin where Daniel had lived, surrounded by the boy's few possessions. The workbooks filled with careful writing, the books Thomas had given him, the small collection of treasures that included interesting rocks, a bird's nest, and a photograph of Daniel with Thomas that must have been taken shortly before the old man died. They were both smiling in the photo, and Jake could see the bond between them, the way Thomas's large hand rested protectively on Daniel's shoulder. Jake thought about the battles ahead. He would need a lawyer, which meant money he did not have. He would need to prove he could provide stability. when his entire adult life had been defined by the opposite. He would need to convince strangers that a drifter and a runaway could become a family, that love and commitment mattered more than conventional qualifications. But as he sat there in the fading light, holding that photograph and thinking about Daniel's courage, Jake felt something settle in his chest. This was what Thomas Brennan had seen in him, not what he had been, but what he could become. A man who would fight for what mattered, a man who would keep his promises, a man worthy of the trust a dying man and a frightened boy had placed in him. On Monday, he would start the legal battle. But tonight, Jake made another promise. To the memory of Thomas Brennan and to the boy who was out there somewhere in temporary placement, probably crying himself to sleep. Jake would not give up. He would not walk away. And he would bring Daniel home, no matter what it cost him. The legal battle took 4 months. 4 months during which Jake saw Daniel only during supervised visits at the county social services office. Each meeting was both a blessing and a torment. Watching the boy try to be brave while clearly struggling with being back in the foster system. The temporary placement was better than the previous one, but it was not home, and both of them felt the wrongness of their separation like a physical ache. Jake hired a lawyer named Sarah Chen, Margaret's niece, who had recently returned to Montana after practicing family law in Seattle. She took the case for a fraction of her normal fee after hearing the full story, and she fought with a ferocity that reminded Jake of her aunt. Together, they built a case not just for Jake's suitability as a guardian, but for the failure of the system that had driven Daniel to run in the first place. The investigation into Daniel's allegations about his previous foster home uncovered evidence that vindicated the boy's story. Other children came forward with similar complaints, and the foster parents lost their license. It was a small victory, but it strengthened Jake's position considerably. The caseworker assigned to Daniel's case, a woman named Patricia Morales, proved to be fair-minded and thorough. She visited the farm multiple times, inspecting the repairs Jake had made and interviewing people in town about his character. Margaret Chen became Jake's strongest advocate, testifying about his work ethic and his commitment to the property. The owner of the hardware store spoke about how Jake always paid his bills on time and treated people with respect. Even Sheriff Bradley wrote a letter supporting Jake's application for guardianship, noting that Jake had ultimately done the right thing by coming forward rather than continuing to hide Daniel. The opposition came from Skyline Development, who hired their own lawyers to argue that Jake was unstable and financially unsuitable to raise a child. They pointed to his history of moving from job to job, his lack of permanent employment, and the condition of the property. Richard Chambers gave a deposition describing Jake as a drifter who had only shown interest in Daniel to maintain control of land that should be developed for the community's benefit. The hearing was scheduled for late October, 4 months after Jake had walked into the sheriff's office with Daniel. Jake wore the only suit he owned, purchased second-hand from a thrift store in Billings, and sat beside Sarah Chen at a table in the county courthouse. Across the room, Patricia Morales sat with Daniel, who kept glancing over at Jake with eyes that held both hope and fear. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Helen Pritchard, known for her no-nonsense approach and her focus on what was genuinely best for children rather than what looked best on paper. She listened to testimony from both sides, asked pointed questions, and reviewed the thick file of documents that Sarah had assembled over the past months. "Mr. Holloway," Judge Pritchard said, addressing Jake directly, "you're asking this court to grant you guardianship of a child you've known for less than 6 months. You have no experience raising children, no family support system, and an employment history that suggests difficulty with commitment. Why should I believe you're prepared to be a parent?" Jake stood, his heart pounding. "Because for the first time in 20 years, I found something worth committing to. I spent 2 decades running from responsibility because I was afraid of failing the people who depended on me. But Daniel showed me that sometimes the greatest failure is never trying at all. He took a breath and continued, I can't promise I'll be perfect. I'll make mistakes and probably more than most, but I can promise that I'll show up every day. I'll make sure he gets an education and has food on the table and knows he's valued. I'll teach him how to work with his hands and take care of himself. And most important, I'll give him what he's never had before, someone who chooses him, not out of obligation or for a paycheck, but because he matters. Judge Pritchard was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Daniel. Young man, you're old enough to have an opinion about your own future. What do you want? Daniel stood, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. I want to live with Jake. He's the first person besides Mr. Brennan who ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere. He keeps his promises, and he doesn't give up on people. That's what a father should be. The judge made her ruling 2 days later. Temporary guardianship would be granted to Jake Holloway for a period of 1 year, during which time the state would monitor the placement to ensure Daniel's well-being. If all went well, permanent guardianship would be granted at the end of that period. It was not everything Jake had hoped for, but it was enough. It was Daniel coming home. The day Jake brought Daniel back to the farm was bright with autumn sunshine. The trees along the creek had turned gold and red, and there was a crispness in the air that promised winter was not far off. Daniel climbed out of the truck and stood in the yard, looking at the cabin and the barn and the main house with its new roof and repaired walls. Welcome home, Jake said quietly. Daniel turned and threw his arms around Jake's waist, holding on tight. Thank you for not giving up on me. Jake knelt down to look Daniel in the eye. That's what family does. We don't give up on each other. That evening, they sat on the porch of the main house, which Jake had finally made livable. Inside, Daniel's belongings were unpacked in the bedroom Jake had prepared for him, with bookshelves Jake had built and a window that looked out over the mountains. The vintage Triumph still sat in the barn, waiting for the day when Daniel would be old enough to learn to ride it, a connection to the past and a promise for the future. A letter had arrived that morning from Richard Chambers and Skyline Development. They were withdrawing their offer to purchase the property and dropping their legal challenges. The publicity from the guardianship hearing had not been favorable to them, and they had apparently decided the land was not worth the continued fight. It was not a complete victory, but it was breathing room, time to build something lasting. Jake thought about Thomas Brennan, who had somehow known that a drifter and a runaway could save each other. He thought about the $2 that had bought him not just land, but purpose and connection and love. And he thought about the future stretching ahead, full of challenges and work, and the daily effort of being the father Daniel deserved. You know what Thomas told me once? Daniel said, breaking the comfortable silence. He said that the best things in life are the ones you have to fight for. He said easy victories don't mean much, but the hard-won ones change who you are. Smart man, Jake agreed. They sat together as darkness fell over their land, their home, their hard-won family. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Holloway felt like he had finally stopped running and found where he belonged.